Governor, welcome and good morning.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Jones, Chairman Norman, Chairman Hanger, Chairman Ware, Speaker Cox, members of the General Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And to Speaker Cox, happy birthday. I also want to recognize our First Lady, Pam Northam. Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax. And members of my cabinet. Virginia is better because of your efforts. I'm very proud of the work our cabinet has done. I'm also proud that our First Lady is helping Virginia unify early childhood education. I'm here today for the first time as governor to report on the financial health of the Commonwealth for the budget year that recently ended. This morning, I would also like to discuss a few key issues we need to address as we look forward to the next budget that we will consider together in a few months. Of course, we all feel like we just finished the last budget. But December will be here before we know it, so we are starting once again. First, I want to thank you. My first 7 months in office have been a whirlwind, and we have accomplished a lot together. We haven't always agreed on things, but we have always been civil. We've followed the Virginia way. With your help over these past months, we shored up our finances. We put a record amount into cash reserves, which led the rating agencies to remove our negative outlook. That protected our AAA bond rating. Our bond rating is critically important. I thank you all for working with me to protect it. We've seen Virginia rise to number 4 as the best state in the country to do business. That's up from 7th last year and 13th just a few years ago. I am confident that together we can get back to number 1. We were able to give a raise to hard-working Virginians around the state, our teachers, our public safety officers, and state employees. And again, I thank you for working together to make that happen. We also worked together to raise the felony larceny threshold, which had remained at levels set in 1983. In doing this, we were also able to address the issue of restitution. And we worked across the aisle to provide health care access for about 400,000 working Virginians. It wasn't easy, but we came together and compromised on a solution that will increase access to care and create incentives to work. It took real leadership to forge this compromise, and I thank you for getting it done. Now it's up to our administration to make sure these 400,000 Virginians can access this health care. And we're working diligently to make everyone proud of how we roll this out. We have worked together to invest in broadband in rural areas to ensure that no corner of Virginia is left behind in the 21st century. I'm grateful for your shared commitment to this effort. I want everyone in Virginia, whether they live in a rural area, a city, or somewhere in between, to have access to quality job opportunities. Every job in 2018 depends on the internet. Every Virginia community needs it, and I appreciate your support on this issue. We have shown Virginians and the world that here in Richmond, we still work together to do the right thing for our people. And we can use that same model of compromise and civility to accomplish much more. We're at a unique moment in Virginia where we can show the rest of the country what leadership looks like. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about our current fiscal picture. I want to thank all of the economists, business leaders, and General Assembly members who volunteer to help provide our consensus revenue forecast. This is important work, and I thank you, Secretary Lane, for your steady hand. Fiscal year 2018 marks 10 years since the Great Recession began. Here in Virginia, we've enjoyed steady growth since then, but it hasn't been spectacular. While data isn't always available in real time, here's what we know. Virginia added 58,000 jobs in fiscal year 2018, and non-farm employment has expanded for 50 consecutive months. This brings our employment level to an all-time high of more than 4 million people working. Our June unemployment rate was steady at 3.2%, the lowest rate in over a decade. Our final numbers for fiscal year 2018 show that wages and salaries are growing. We saw growth in payroll taxes, which helped drive our surplus. Payroll withholding and sales tax are the two revenue sources most closely linked to the health of the economy, and together they increased 4.9%. And the big piece of good news is that in fiscal year 2018, our general fund revenue collections exceeded the official forecast by $555.5 million, a record surplus for Virginia. Because of our prudent effort to shore up our cash reserves, this surplus has been obligated to restricted funds, including the Revenue Stabilization Fund, the new Revenue Reserve Fund, and the Water Quality Improvement Fund that has made our rivers and streams cleaner than ever before in modern Virginia. Together, these funds will help us ensure that we will be able to weather future economic downturns. That's especially important as we see this year's federal deficit growing close to $1 trillion, bringing the federal debt to $21 trillion. As a result of federal tax changes, Virginians will pay about $4 billion less in federal taxes every year. Conforming to these federal changes will increase state revenues. I believe this gives us a unique chance to invest in our state and our people. We need to take this opportunity to invest in working families and Virginia's Main Street businesses. Smart investments are the way to take Virginia and our economy to the next level. As I've traveled the Commonwealth and the globe, the number one thing I hear from businesses is that if Virginia has the workers who can perform the jobs of the 21st century, business will expand in Virginia and they will locate in Virginia. That's why it's important that we're targeting our workforce programs to the jobs that are in high demand. We want to make sure our workforce has the skill set to be competitive. We have worked together on that, and I hope we can continue to do so. I've already promised that our administration will invest in bringing broadband to the parts of Virginia that lack it. I appreciate that the General Assembly has shared that commitment to make sure we keep the focus on this important issue. This investment will pay off when areas like Southwest Virginia, Southside Virginia, the Valley, and the Eastern Shore have the broadband infrastructure to attract good jobs, allow people to work remotely, and help children in school. There is power in every child, and we all know that a good education can have a huge impact on someone's life and opportunities. But our education spending still hasn't returned to pre-recession levels. We need to invest more in our classrooms and in our educators. And while we did great work on health care, we're not done. As a provider, I recognize that we can do more to improve quality and access and reduce the cost of health care. I've talked to many of you about ideas on how to do that, and I'm committed to working with you to bring costs down and increase access and quality across the Commonwealth. We have a unique opportunity to make these critical investments that will benefit all of Virginia. I also want to make sure all Virginians are treated fairly by the new federal tax policy. While the federal tax changes are significant and provide tax cuts to many Virginians, the imbalanced structure of those federal changes mean that a majority of the benefits are going to the top income earning individuals. While more than half of Virginia taxpayers earn less than $50,000, only 7% of federal tax relief will flow to them. I intend to right that imbalance when I put forward my budget amendments in December to make sure that our middle class and working families benefit too. The best way to help Virginia's families is through the Earned Income Tax Credit. This is a chance for us to level the playing field. We already have the Earned Income Tax Credit in Virginia, like 29 other states. In 24 of those states, it's refundable. Places like Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, but ours is not. If a family qualifies for a $1,000 tax credit, but they only owe $800 in taxes, Virginia currently keeps that additional $200. When we make the credit refundable, we're giving that $200 back so people can get to keep more of their hard-earned money. By making our existing Earned Income Tax Credit refundable, we can help ensure that 600,000 eligible Virginians, many of whom are veterans, get their full tax benefit. You must be working. You must be working to get the Earned Income Tax Credit, which means this action would encourage more people to join or stay in the workforce. Virginians in every community benefit from this, although in some localities, more than a third of filers qualify. I want people in every corner of Virginia to have access to opportunity, no matter who you are or where you're from. This approach will help create that opportunity. The refundable Earned Income Tax Credit will help pay for child care, grocery bills, and other needs, meaning it will flow back into our economy. It will put real money in people's pockets, and it will reduce the impact of other state and local taxes that hit lower income family budgets the hardest. And that's an investment too. We are investing in our working families that earn less than $50,000 a year. The refundable credit will cost less than $250 million. This is a good investment, one that takes exactly $0 from current services. Virginians everywhere want the same thing. They want a good job so they can support themselves and their families. They want a good education for their children. They want access to quality, affordable health care. They want an environment with clean air and water. And they want to live in a Virginia that is inclusive. These smart investments will be another historic step forward in building an economy where everyone has a fair shot at success. I look forward to working with the General Assembly to make these investments a reality. Overall, our picture in Virginia is one of slow, steady growth. I believe we need to continue to budget responsibly and target our investments. That's the Virginia way. When I ran for governor last year, I promised that I would govern to get things done. I said I would always do what is best for the people of Virginia. I promised I'd work with anyone to make our Commonwealth work better for all Virginians, no matter who they are or where they're from. Virginians send us to Richmond to work together to make their lives better. I appreciate your willingness to work with me to find areas of agreement and compromise. I know that we share the goal of making Virginia better. I look forward to continuing our work together to invest in our state and our people so that everyone has a chance at opportunity. I'm grateful for the chance to do that together with all of you, and I appreciate you inviting me here this morning. Thank you so much.
We'll give, okay, I think everyone's exited now. Next, we have Secretary Lane. Aubrey, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Will you be as brief as the governor?
I'm going to try.
Or was that?
Mr. Chairman, I might be briefer. Depends on how many questions I get. But,
and if
I'm
not,
happy to move through this quickly. You know, every time I come here, it is a pleasure, and I look around and I see a lot of blue and red ties, except I know, Senator Norman, I can depend on you to have one of those pink ones on, but I'm wearing green for money this morning, gentlemen. So, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm going to make that a policy as I address
mine's orange for caution.
Whoa, good. I think between the two of us, Mr. Chairman, we're going to do just fine. Good morning. I will move through this relatively quickly. What I want to go through today is certainly put some information behind the governor's speech, but go through quickly our year-end results and looking at where we go forward in terms of preparing for this year's budget, and then also taking a look at some issues that have been I know talked about a lot here in the Commonwealth, tax conformity or policy and internet sales. So with that, we'll just jump right into it. As we usually start, we talk about the factors that impact our economy, and certainly national factors do. This slide just points out that while we are growing in Virginia in terms of both employment, personal income, wages, and salaries, we still are lagging the national standards. If you look at employment, personal income, wages, and salaries, while they're growing, again, we're not keeping up with what's going on at the national level. Part of that has to do with our reliance on fiscal policies and other things coming out of D.C., but the good news is that we are growing. Now, this should be something you've already seen before, and the governor spoke about this historic surplus. So I'll just point out a couple things here on the slide. These are the year-end numbers. If you look, as the governor mentioned, most of the surplus came above what the line where we look at withholding, non-withholding, netted of refunds. Potentially, almost all of that came from there. We did have an increase in sales tax, first time in 3 years that it grew at over 3%, but primarily it resulted from what we saw in withholding and non-withholding. Let me point out here at the bottom of the page, there is $3 million that came over in transfers. That added the $3 million to the $555 million surplus, but that will not go into reserves. Surplus items, that $3 million won't go into reserves. It's just the actual revenues collected. One other point to mention here is if you look at the top withholding line, it looks like we grew about 5.4%. I'll get into that a little bit later. About $120 million that was received in June, we would have normally seen in July of this year because of the way the July 4th holiday fell. Many people who were out those 2 days before July 4th, it was on a Wednesday, paid their withholdings in the last day of June. So while it was up and the money was collected in the fiscal 2018, we're going to see that given back in July, and I'll get to that a little bit later. When you discount that, two things. our withholding really grew about 4.4%, which is still very, very good. But it really puts the surplus about $450 million, which is really in line with what we've been talking about over the last 5 or 6 months. So I did want to point that out, but obviously good news for most of our revenue sources, the major. If you look below sales taxes, though, you'll see that every other part of our budget did not meet expectations. So while they're not as significant as the major drivers, we have some issues when you get to other parts of our budget. Now, again, this is just a graph of showing the general fund revenues. And what's important here is it looks like we had a steady increase. And of course, I'll get into the non-withholdings that happened in December and April in a little bit. But the good news is that we were up 6.3% for the year, and that's positive, leading to the historical surplus, which Governor Northam mentioned. Now, payroll withholdings, again, here, I think the key item to point out is the steady growth in the line. While we had some issues in December and March because of timing of when payroll was paid, the good news is we saw a steady climb in payroll withholding. And as you know, this is about 66% of our entire revenues for the state is this line. And if you discount the $120 million, we grew about 4.4%. So that's very, very positive for the Commonwealth. Now, if you look at where that growth came from, the governor mentioned about some of our low unemployment. The parts in green are what's driving the major employment centers or areas that's driving this growth. And it was pretty well broad-based, but most of the growth came in services. If you look at those items that are shaded in green, they are service-oriented. Now, a lot of times when people talk about the tech economy here and where these tech jobs are, they would be reflected in federal contractors and professional and business services. So you can see we have a lot of opportunity there. Again, the point is it was broad-based, growing mostly in services. And while that is good for payroll, it's not necessarily reflective totally in our sales tax. Sales tax, you know, we don't tax services. And we're seeing a trend in our economy. So I just point that out as to alerting you where we are growing in the Commonwealth. Now, this is a story we've been talking about for the last 5 or 6 months, and that is non-withholding. I won't review everything that we've already spoken about over the last few months, but this graph shows the volatility of non-withholding. It is the most volatile revenue source that we have. And as we've been discussing over these last few months, we've had significant increases, almost $325 million collected more than what we had anticipated. Now, I'll call your attention to the last bullet on this page because it's talked about the collar. For those of you who don't know what the collar means is because of the volatility of this particular revenue source, and I'll remind all of you back to 2014, we had a significant budget deficit as a result of projecting from 2013 non-withholding that we thought was going to continue, and it turned out not. Remember, non-withholding is basically wealth-generated items that are not reflected through payroll withholding. You sell stock, you sell a business. That typically generates non-withholding. But the collar was put in to shelter the general fund from these ups and downs. But we still look at these trends, and if you look at the bottom, we were expecting, or without the collar, we would have expected maybe almost $200 million more this year. At least the economic models were calling for that. So that sort of gives credence to the next slide that I wanted to point out, something that we've been tracking, and these are the high-income taxpayers in the Commonwealth. Remember, when this first occurred in December, we were unsure because of the federal tax law changes whether this was a result of federal tax policy and maybe not going to result in true wealth generation, or was it true wealth generation? Well, as time has gone on, it looks like it is moving towards actual wealth generation. Because we've tracked these high filers, and even though we don't have all the returns in, remember, the returns are not due until November 1st, As of May 1st, you're required by law to pay the Commonwealth all that you owe, but you have until November 1st to file these returns. And we've seen as they've come in, although there's still 420 outstanding, that we're not giving back big refunds. So when you combine this, although we're not out of the woods yet, we still don't know 100%, but when you combine this, what our models were calling for, it's looking like a lot of this surplus that we saw in non-withholding was from wealth generation. And I'll remind you, at a 5.75% tax rate, that means for every dollar you pay us, you've had over a $17 wealth generation. So bodes well. The question is whether or not that will recur. It won't be forecasting this year because of the collar. It'll go up a little bit, but we won't see the total amount. We don't take last year and forecast off this. So wanted to point out to you, good news that we see there. Whether or not it's sustainable, we'll know a little bit more. If you go back to the previous graph, you can see that some years it continues, but many years after we've had a big increase, it goes to a large decrease. So that's the question we're going to be dealing with as we go forward here. As we talked before, and the governor mentioned in his speech, that our sales tax collections did slightly exceed our 3% budget. The good news is that's the best it's grown in the last 3 years. The previous 2 years were only about 2%. And it looks like a lot of it, we didn't have a great Christmas season, as you can tell, but we did have a pretty good spring. And it looks like a lot of that had to do with housing improvements. I'm going to see the reverse of that when I get to one of our other revenue sources, but it looks like in the spring it was driven by people spending on their housing. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit later about internet taxes and how that may be some winds at our back here, but I also want to point out that sales and use tax are one of the biggest drivers that we use for attracting business. We give exemptions to business. So that, I believe, is part of why we're seeing a little bit of sluggish growth also, because as we can, and I'm not suggesting we stop, I'm just pointing out to you that when we give those exemptions, therefore we are taking them off the table in our growth. And I think that's part of what we're seeing in the numbers. Again, I am not suggesting that that is not a good use of them. I'm just only pointing out what it may be on the impact of the growth. I know a lot of times we say it's internet taxes, and I'll get to that in a few minutes, but this also impacts the growth in our sales tax. Now, here are all the other revenue sources, and if you remember from the front page, all of these did not meet expectations. I'll draw your attention to, the corporate income tax. If you remember, the first report I gave here, I believe, was back in January, and again in February. Corporate income tax was running well ahead of the projections. And there was talk about maybe we should take some of that into income. But we wisely did not, because it's very volatile. And as you see, we did not meet the budget in corporate income taxes. It doesn't mean we won't meet it this year, but it depends on the nature of businesses. I do believe business will probably be helped with some of the federal tax cuts, so we'll see how that plays out. But I again point out some of these particular volatile revenue sources, taking them at a point in time may not give you the whole story. The next item, recordation taxes, that's primarily related to housing. And although if you live in Richmond, housing is pretty strong, that's not what we're seeing across the rest of the state and the nation. In fact, the headlines are filled with housing slowing. I think there's several reasons for that. Part of that is for federal tax changes, limitations on deductions. Interest rates are going up. That tends to reduce the need for housing. There are mortgage limits. If you look at what's selling, it's homes under about $450,000, I mean general, and then homes over $1.5 million. Over $1.5 million, people tend to pay cash. Those under $450,000 are the maximum loan they can get with the minimum down payment. So that tends to drive it. And the supply of new homes. The industry has learned its lesson, and when they see a downturn, they quit building. And so really, that's lending us to the point that I don't see a quick turnaround in home sales. So recordation taxes tend to lag. Insurance premium tax simply deals with the taxes we collect from insurance agencies. We had some refunds, I believe, that were one-time in nature we've talked about. Hopefully that will not repeat itself this year, and this will continue to grow. So this brings us to one topic that I don't normally talk about, but I believe I'm going to make at least a topic of quarterly, and that is our Transportation Trust Fund. The Transportation Trust Fund is what basically supports the major initiatives you see in transportation across the Commonwealth. And although we do receive federal funding, the majority of maintenance and repairs and a big part of construction is because of state funding. If you look at the motor fuels tax, which is the largest component outside of our vehicle sales, they're about the same usually because vehicle sales tends to be very volatile. We were expecting to go at 3.3% this year. We actually were down 1.7%. Now, there's some short-term reasons for that, the price of gasoline, but I think there's some long-term reasons. I've got a graph I'll get to in a minute that'll explain those. Fortunately, vehicle sales taxes were up. Well, they weren't up. They weren't as down as much as we projected, and that's because it looks like in the second quarter of this year, in order to beat the steel tariffs, there was a splurge in automobile buying. And you can look across not only our statistics, but across the country. Automobiles went up quite a bit when the tariffs were announced and trying to beat those price increases. So again, it helped offset, but the bottom line is that our Transportation Trust Fund continues to suffer. And here is a graph that I think pictorially looks at that. These are the state motor fuel taxes historically since 2009. And of course, in 2013, we passed historic legislation, first time in 36 years, where we did increase state taxes. Now, the taxes we collected in 14 and 15 were not the whole story, because remember, we had bonds. There were bonds that were issued that we were using for construction. And that helped get us through 14 and 15. But they ran out. And now, fortunately, we put in 2313. If you recall, and I'll talk about sales tax, or internet sales tax a little bit later, there was a portion of that was tied to the Marketplace Fairness Equity Act. If that didn't occur, we increased the gas taxes, which we did. But with all that activity, we are getting back basically to where we were. We have not seen a significant increase in state fuel taxes, save it for two areas, Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, where additional taxes are being collected in terms of for project in those areas. And I know there's been a discussion with Transportation Secretary Valentine. That's why most of the construction on the interstates have been either funded by those taxes regionally or tolls. And that's one topic I don't have to talk a lot about more in front of you, but tolls have been funding those areas. I point this out again because not only in the short term do we have price of gasoline down, and we could get a blip if it goes up, although it doesn't appear to be on any time in the future. And remember, for the most part, we're supported by, I think it's about $3.11, the wholesale gas price. So we're actually below that at the retail level for regular. So we've got a ways to go before we get there. But the long term, what we see is more hybrids, more electric vehicles on the road. This is a long-term declining source for us. Where we stand today, we have about $400 to $450 million for new construction in the Commonwealth at the state level. That's what we have. And if you have, no matter where you are in the state, you could have an interchange that costs $200 million in that. So you can see we don't have a lot across the state. And I want to point this out because I don't believe this is going to be a slow decline. In 2020 and 21, Volvo and GM have both said they will no longer produce gasoline engines. So we're going to see this drop pretty precipitously as we go across. And I just point that out as something for the members to consider as we're looking at alternatives. The governor spoke about the historic surplus. What I wanted to present here is a balance sheet that basically shows the Money Committee staff that these monies have been reserved on the balance sheet and will either go into stabilization fund or cash reserves. In fact, Almost $937 million are reserved here. When you add the $45 million per year in the biennium budget coming up, in 2 years, we'll be over $1 billion in reserves. And to see that pictorially, this is what you normally looked at. This was the stabilization fund. Of course, we knew how the cash reserves. Thank you for your legislative effort on putting that in. But the stabilization fund has mandatory increases and decreases. The point I would put out here, we're not planning any withdrawals from this over the next 2 years. As you recall, that was one of the issues the rating agencies had with us, is that we were drawing monies from this fund while our general fund revenues were increasing. But if you go to the second slide here, what I've done is also added here the cash reserves. Over and above the stabilization fund, the new cash reserve fund, and you'll see by 2020 that gets us to over $1 billion. I still believe we have work to do here. And one of the things that I have talked with the Money Committee staff about and working with my staff is some policy and guidance on when we should add and subtract from these reserves so that we don't find ourselves in the same place we did just this past year, had historic low levels going forward. Now, if there's no questions on, this is the past fiscal year. If there's no questions on that, I'll continue on heading into the current year. Okay. These were the collections in July. July is not, first of all, let me tell you how we start the current year. We finished the year, if you look at the third column, with the surplus and about $20.5 billion, and that we're expecting this year in the official estimate about $20.8 billion in the general fund. That would imply that we need to increase about 1.4%. But then I'll recall that you need to remember we had about $120 million switch over that we weren't expecting in last year. We really need to grow about 2% to make that up, and payroll needs to go about 3.6%, not 2.6%. We grew faster than that this year. I don't see any reason for alarm, but wanted to point out to you that we're going to have to make up that $120 million in the current fiscal year. Now, before we move on and get into actual specifics, some of the things that we'll look at that may impact this coming year, at least on the revenue side. The governor mentioned some of them in the speech. And I've talked about in the last few months some tailwinds, but I'm not convinced that they're tailwinds or they're windfalls. And what I'm talking about is the federal budget that we just saw passed and the federal tax cuts. Certainly both are stimulative, at least in the short term. But the governor mentioned the impact on the debt. The debt this past year, the Government Accounting Office has confirmed it's risen from over $600 million at the federal level to anticipate to be at $1.1 trillion this year, directly a result of the tax cuts put in at the federal level. That doesn't mean that they won't prove worthy in the long run, but just in the current fiscal year, bringing our debt to $21 trillion, as the governor has mentioned. So I think we need to keep that in term as whether or not these trends that we see are sustainable or they're one-time in nature. Certainly, if you look at most economic models, particularly on the national level, everyone's expecting the next couple of years, 18 months, to be pretty good, but then they show growth slowing fairly aggressively. So again, I point this out, something we ought to consider as we go forward, particularly as it relates to not only spending, one-time spending versus ongoing spending, but also the level that we have in our reserve funds. Now, this gets us right to July. Again, July was not a significant month. We collected about $1.2 billion. We're expecting about $1.3 billion. And the issue, we had a slight, we would have been over about $100 million had we not had that $120 million switch. So we had a small deficit for the month, but I believe, I think, again, see nothing in the actual trends that causes me an alarm other than the fact that we need to consider that as we go forward. The process of going toward the budget will begin with the forecasting for this coming year revenues. You can read here, I'll point out 3 important dates in October. The Joint Advisory Board of Economists, or JV, will meet October 11th. November the 19th, the Monday before the Thanksgiving holiday, GACR, the Governor's Advisory Council on Revenue Estimates, with the economists, they will meet. And then, of course, on December 18th of this year, the governor will present the revenue forecast and his budget to the legislature. So we've got some work to do ahead of us, and I think if we understand on where we've been, that will help us discern on where we may end up. So, Mr. Chairman, that sort of concludes my remarks on the revenues for the past year and where we're starting this year. I'll move into tax policy unless there's any specific questions.
Are there any questions for the Secretary at this point? Seeing no takers?
Thank you very much. So, tax policy, first of all, this is something I know it's been talked about for the last 7 or 8 months. And before I get into the actual model and some of the results, I want to make sure that we're talking, a lot of people talk about reform, they talk about policy, they talk about conformity. I think it's important for us to understand at least what we define as what those terms are. And let me first start with conformity. What conformity means is that Virginia generally adopts the federal definitions of income and other items that we meet either as deductions or exemptions. Not the level of them, but what the definitions are. We start at adjusted gross income as a conformity state, and then we take various items, whether above the line, whether it's business expenses or student loan interest, they come off, and then we apply Virginia standards. So conformity means that we're just adopting and agreeing to what the federal definitions of these items are. It's not the amount. We currently do not conform to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Our last conformity date before that came into being. And we need to advance the date of conformity to this year so that we have some certainty to the 2019 filing season. But let me point out to bullet 4. The date conformity does not mean that we've taken all the different policies decisions that you and the governor and everybody else may want to consider. Standard deductions, the amount of them, is not part of conformity. The itemization itself, the definition of what are itemized deductions, are not part of conformity. Whether you want to change the rule as to whether it's, we have a rule now in separate law that says whatever you do at the federal level has to be at the state level. That is not part of conformity. So when I speak about asking us to move forward to conformity, it's to give certainty to make sure we match, or if there's anything in particular you don't want to conform to as definitions. Although I would tell you, we had a small one last year, and I think if you ask most tax preparers, it was probably cost people more to file their return than they got in benefit for doing it. So I would encourage as much conformity as we possibly can. But that's really what conformity means. Reform might mean a lot of different other items that come into play. Now, I've also heard a lot of people talk about in terms of policy and what's fair and what's equitable. I've dealt with the tax code a long time in and out of my life, both as a preparer, although you wouldn't want me to do your return, I assure you, but as a business owner and now as being in charge of this in terms of working with the tax department at the state level. And I can tell you, I don't rarely hear what I hear is fair. What we really see in the code is what is policy and what is revenue generation. That's really what's in the code. So there may be different policies that you want to achieve in that, and that's something that we ought to have the debate on, but I would recommend to you it be separate than conformity so that we can at least tell our taxpayers and the preparers out there what they can at least talk to their clients about in terms of some certainty in that. If we fail to advance the date of conformity, you can look at the last bullet. There are up to 20 complex modifications or systems that we would have to put in place at the Virginia level. For individual, over 30 for business. Quite frankly, that would be we couldn't do that. We're too late in the year to be able to do that. So as a realistic, I would encourage us all to look at moving forward with the conformity. Then let's have this debate on whether or not there are other policy adjustments you'd like to have. And even though we may not be in session, if we could all at least agree, I know we have some of the preparers here in the audience, that signal to them that's what we're going to do, not so much about other policies, I think that would give them some help in giving some guidance to their tax preparers. So that's what, when we talk about conformity, that's what, at least from the administration, we're talking with you about. Now, let's get into the actual model. This has been something that's been talked about a long time. And let me first of all introduce the team that's worked on this. From tax, we have Craig Burns, John Lehman, Bill White, and Kristen Collins. All of you know them. They're here. My deputy secretary, June Jennings, is here. But it's not just tax because of the many things. David Mall from Department of Accounts, Stephanie Hamlet from the Virginia Resources Authority, David Swinford is here from Treasury, and of course Dan Timberlake, can't miss Dan, is here from that. So what we've tried to do is to build this model so that we take out the anecdotal opinions that everybody has and really look at what happens on Virginians. Let me point out, the model does not come to a conclusion. The model does not make a recommendation. It's an interactive model. All it does is give you parameters or consequences of actions. And I want to make it clear, I've already talked to the staff, the money staff, that all these people are here at your disposal to run any set of policy changes you want through the model. So this is not about us controlling the model. Anything you want them to go through, they will run for you in terms of policy changes. It is also in your packet. You have a summary. It is also posted online. And everybody, I want the public to be able to look at all of the various options that are available and which we have this debate. But let me point out, the one thing that's not online is the proprietary model. And that's because we paid for it. And I don't want other states being able to use it without us paying for it. It's to your use, but I'm not going to give it to them for free. But all the results of it are online. So the model has to also make some assumptions, just like every taxpayer. The assumptions it has to make is, do you want to optimize between federal and state? Do you want to maximize a federal benefit, or do you want to maximize a state benefit? We assume that most rational taxpayers would want to optimize the difference between federal and state. But that is a choice. That is a choice that each taxpayer will make. And as we go through the numbers, you'll see that some may not make that choice because the benefit is not worth it to them at the federal level. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. Let me also point out, we have to make choices today. Even before the Jobs Tax Credit Act went into, or Cuts Act went into being, there were differences between state and federal. Let's take the standard deduction. I'll use a married couple. Right now in Virginia, our law is $6,000 for the standard deduction. The old law before the tax cuts was $12,000. We had people in Virginia had to make that decision today whether or not it was best for them if they had deductions, itemization between that level to take the standard deduction or not. Now it's $24,000 at the federal level. Obviously, it's gotten greater. But those decisions were already being made, and that was my point. It's not what's fair, it's what decisions based on policy do we want individuals to make in determining what actions they should take. So I point that out because I get to the next paragraph, and that is we still have not received guidance, IRS guidance on all the provisions. In fact, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning that was urging Congress to fix at the business expense level for depreciation. They didn't define the term renovations correctly. And so therefore, if you had a new building, you tore it all down, so you got the credit. If you renovated with the same cost, you got no credit. So there are still significant problems that are occurring. Another key point, state revenues do not equal the impact. The federal tax changes are greater for state revenues than they are on Virginians. And the reason for that is we have about 10% of our revenues come from non-resident filers. And if you've owned real estate or anything like that, you know what I'm talking about. You have to file income tax, apportioned return. So if a particular item will be more in state revenue than it is an impact on Virginia taxpayers because of our non-state filers. So the last thing I'll point out before I get into the detailed numbers is that all these provisions are interrelated. If you pull one out, then you may not get their answer because of their relationship. I'll have an example later, but the itemized deductions, now there are limits. But the federal law also has phased out, or it used to have a phase out as you reach certain income levels, you couldn't get 100% of those. That's gone now. So if you don't combine those two, on a particular taxpayer, you may not get the appropriate answer. So don't want to spend a lot about caveats, but what I really wanted to point out is that this model should be used at looking at trends and consequences. It may not be for a specific taxpayer. So with that, Mr. Chairman, we'll get right into the numbers. This would be by, I'm sorry. Excuse me. I'm sorry. We'll get into the numbers now. Forgot to hit the clicker there. On a roll, Mr. Chairman. I apologize.
You have an able-bodied assistant to keep you in
Yeah,
line.
thank you very much. Excuse me. So I won't go through every number here, but I will point out there are roughly 3.67 million tax returns by residents. This is residents only, filed in Virginia. And you'll notice the governor mentioned there were $4 billion that Virginians will probably not have to pay because at the federal level. But that's a net number. Everybody assumes it's a positive. It's not. Almost 10% of individuals, 10.2%, will actually have to pay almost $975 million more dollars because of the federal tax changes. Now, most people are going to get a benefit, and all income classes get a net benefit, but it's basically a $5 billion benefit netted by a $1 billion offset. So again, even if you look at income levels, you can't look specifically at that without taking the specific taxpayer into account. So the other thing I'd point out here, I've broken these down between various income levels. And you can break them down differently. The reason I broke it down 50,000 and under is because 52.2% of all tax returns in Virginia are under 50,000. Those under 50,000, their average federal benefit will be about $146. If you then look from 50,000 to 150,000, and that's almost 1.3 million taxpayers, their benefit will be $1,516. So $1,516. And if you look at all taxpayers over $150,000, their average benefit will be almost $3,800. So you can see, now that's not everybody. You can pick somebody in every one of those levels and get something different. I'm just picking an average to show sort of what the impacts are as you go across. And the governor mentioned, if you do those calculations, only about 7% flow to those income levels of 50,000 left. The reason that's statistically important is that's over half the tax returns in Virginia. Now, if you want to see then what the offset is if you go to the next slide, the offset is what if we totally conformed and we did not change Virginia law, what the impact would be on Virginians. And again, I'll point out here, not everybody pays more. In fact, only 25% of all Virginians, looks like 26%, will have an increase. Most will have no impact or a small increase, not an additional taxes. And it varies by income level. So let me again go through those. Under $50,000, they would have to pay $24.15, the average, there's some either way, in more taxes. From 150,000 to from 50,000 to 150,000, the average taxpayer would have to pay $115.50 more. And for those taxpayers over 150,000, they would have to pay $297 more. So the issue is that on a net basis, you're going to see all people are going to win. It's just the varying difference of how much they win or they lose depending on the individual. Now, of course, those at the lower level pay less income taxes than the higher level. So, I mean, we can go through all that, but I'm just showing you the net impacts on income level for the average taxpayers in those tax brackets in that. Now, if you go to the next slide, it simply adds these two together, and you can still see that even with all the federal benefits, there are still 16% of people in Virginia that are going to have a net negative. Most people get a positive, but not everybody. And most of that's because of those federal people, and most of them are higher income, that didn't get a break at the federal level. Now, most of those have to be, that provision that really for most of those was not being able to offset losses now that once were considered against their income, now they have to take it forward or consider it passive. So again, not everybody benefits and not everybody loses, depending on how you define those terms. But if you define them as the net benefit, what I was hoping to show here is that you can't take one item and it's our average for everybody. Now, I know there's a lot of numbers, Mr. Chairman, and you're going to have time to go through them. I'm just trying to give you a way to look at it. If you go to the next slide, I think this is what people would really like to see. This is the impact on our revenues. If you look at it for fiscal 2019, looks like we should have almost $600 million if we totally conform and make no changes to Virginia law. Now, I want to point out here, most of that is from individual provisions, and if you go down to the graph below, they are temporary. They expire in 2025. And I point that out because we had the issue of structural balance. If we're looking to use these revenues, we need to consider the nature of them. And right now, they could be extended, but right now they expire. The business provisions are permanent, but most of the individuals' provisions are not. So what I would encourage us to do is to keep in mind whatever policy and understand that that policy could change in 5 or 6 years, depending on federal action in that. So if we decide to use these revenues, understand the ongoing nature versus the one-time nature of them. I will also point out just quickly in 19, had we started working on this at the beginning of the year, many people would have probably started adjusting their withholdings already for Virginia tax or maybe made estimated payments. Obviously, they don't have that because we haven't made any decisions yet. So 19 is a lot of effects we might have saw in 18 is going to into 19. So the 19 numbers do have a portion of that in there. And again, I'll point out 11% of these revenues come from non-resident taxpayers. Now, the next slide, and this will, I know, is a lot of detail, but these are all the provisions that you look at that impact and what the revenue sources are. And I'll point to your attention, the one most often spoken of is number 4, the repeal and limitation on certain itemized deductions. That is the largest provision impact to our revenues in the Commonwealth. But you probably need to look at simulation 6, number 6, because most of those, or a lot of those, are offset by that phase out of that standard deduction itemization I was talking about. This is what gives rise. The way the model works is it assumes that people would optimize it, but if you pull out one of these provisions, you need to take care to make sure that that taxpayer wasn't getting a benefit from another provision. And let me go to that. The next slide just simply talks about the various income levels and what the limitation of certain itemized deductions and the repeal of the piece limitation. Now, I know the $239 million is different than the $366 on the previous page. That's because of moving some numbers from 18 into 19 and non-resident filers. I can reconcile that. But if you looked at these two deductions, you can see that the higher income taxpayers are not impacted by the limitation on certain itemized deductions. In fact, people over $1 million get a benefit because of the phase out of the other exemptions. If you look again if you just took out this one provision, for those under $50,000, it would cost the average taxpayer $354. Those between $50 and $150, $400. And those over $250, $635. But when you take in the piece part of it, the itemized deduction that's offset, it's only $150. not going to remember all that, but I wanted to point out to you, there's a table here for you to look at to understand that there are impacts besides specific provisions. Finally, this is the table that I showed you before, the number of people, Mr. Chairman, that would actually be impacted by switching in the itemized deduction if they itemize. About 640,000 taxpayers, 77,000 of those returns would be impacted by the limitation or the Peace Amendment. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, just quickly, the governor's, what he laid out, what he had proposed. On the next page, this lists graphically of the impact on those under $50,000. You can see 52% of Virginians, incomes under $50,000, they receive about 7% of the federal benefits, but would pay, if we didn't conform, about 13.8% of the Virginia tax due. Again, this is not gross numbers, it's percentages looking at the impact in there. But did want to point that out as the governor believes that these people, when he talked about imbalance in the federal structure. Now, if you go to the next slide, this basically talks about where the governor, where he reiterated this morning what he sees as having to use some of these revenues. Let me point out that he mentioned all these: broadband access, workforce development, more affordable health care. He certainly understands the one-time nature of some of these revenues in that regard. And then, of course, down below he talks about, we mentioned the earned income tax credit. He mentioned $250 million. It's actually going to be less than $250 million. I'll point out that this was really favored by President Reagan and Speaker Ryan as a way in terms of looking at their attack on poverty. But right now, 600,000 people qualify. Only 200,000 of those actually get their full benefit, and that was one of the reasons why the governor recommended that this be any part of any tax policy considerations. One quick comment: the earned income tax credit is not computed based on your tax liability. It is simply a level of income, number of dependents. We use the tax liability as a vehicle to collect it. And if it goes beyond that, many states refund it, but it is not directly related to your income tax liability. I'm sure, as the governor mentioned, that while he wants to be a part of this, we're open and look to other policy adjustments that the legislature would certainly want to explore. So, Mr. Chairman, that was not so brief, but that got us through the tax. I've got one more topic on internet because I know there's been a lot of issues in that. What I presented for you here is current law. House Bill 2013 had a provision in there if in fact Congress passed the law, that there would be an automatic reversal of some of the provisions in 2313, and these monies would go to transportation. That is not the case. It's very prescriptive that Congress has to act. Only right now the Supreme Court has ruled. So we do not currently have a law in our books, but I would assume that until there was a change in law, that it would go through the current formula. Now, that again is subject to the legislature, because obviously I think if we put a law in our books and didn't consider that Congress might act, then we may be opening ourselves up to having to reverse something we put into law very quickly, and I'll come to that. If we were to get $250 million, and I know I've talked between $250 and $300 million, we've done a little more research. Two things that have come to light. One is that many retailers, from we looked at this several years ago, may now be paying internet sales tax in the Commonwealth. They may have already started that. We don't exactly know, but our best estimates, I'm using the lower end to give us some cushion there. And also, these dollars would be reduced when, in fact, if there was a law passed, the Supreme Court said you must not be burdensome on small retailers, and we would have to put a limit in. South Dakota used 100,000. Probably in Virginia would be a little greater than that, I would guess, because of our population. Still unclear as to how that works. But these revenues would be reduced by that exclusion also. But as you see, you go through here, this is where the money would be distributed. Much of it is already restricted or goes strict right out through the current formula. We would have about $90 million, $89.2 million would be unrestricted general fund that would be available for ongoing expenditures. Much of it goes right to education. And of course, some goes to transportation. Approximately $40 million goes to transportation. And then the regional funds that I spoke of earlier goes right to there. I know I saw a comment Senator Stanley had regarding some schools. Part of the money already goes directly in there. 1% is already going for those schools as part of the current calculation of our current rules. For the Money Committee staff, this is net of the dealer discount, so you have to take that into account. It's a small percentage there. I will just point out that under the rules, transportation would receive more monies by leaving what's in place instead of reversing it and running it through the current formula. They would net about $20 million or so more if $250 million is what we actually get. Now, I put this one article in here to wrap this up. They're showing up more repeatedly in the Wall Street Journal, other trade magazines. Large internet retailers are asking Congress to act. They want a standardized rule across the country. So I do believe, whether it's this session, we're going to sooner or later see congressional action. And I think we need to consider that as we put in anything in the sales tax. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to wrap up. I've given you all this great information about all these revenues that are going to be gushing in here. I didn't want to leave you to think that we may have some commitments on those already, and just give you a few to think about. First of all, the major employment and investment project approval commission obligations, obviously can't be public of what that is. Those of you that are on that know we've made some commitments that are not budgeted. For those who don't know what that is, these are projects, incentives given to businesses that are not made public because of competitive reasons, but the leadership in the General Assembly is involved in those decisions. But they are not budgeted as we speak today. I intended the JLARC review of the Virginia Retirement System investment earnings and understand what may happen if our investment earnings do not reach the targeted level. And it appears that there may be in jeopardy. We might want to consider that based on our general fund revenues. This has been discussed. Federal actions, many of the grants coming now out of D.C. Are being changed. For instance, in transportation, there used to be bonus monies we could have each year. They're now being moved more to competitive grants. So we need to consider that as we're looking. And, of course, any budget action that could impact us because of our reliance on those federal dollars. There are some agency projects that are out there that we haven't settled. Most of them you already know about, the Northrop Grumman settlement that has to be taken care of. We're replacing the human resource system that we're working with the money committees on. The Virginia State Police, their STARS program that have to be contemplated in case of statewide emergencies. Transportation funding, I've already talked about some of the risks we have there. And then I would also ask you to consider capital allocation. Much as I found in the in transportation, the priority of how we spend money on capital, I think we could do better on. We have many assets that have deferred maintenance across the Commonwealth. Mr. Chairman, I know I took a long time, but that concludes my remarks.
You had a lot to say. Are there any questions? Seeing none. Oh, I'm sorry. Golly day. It is the Speaker's birthday, and I think you might have a lunch date. No, just kidding. Delegate Garrett, then Chairman Ware, and then Vice Chairman Landis. Let me look over here to the, okay. We'll start with those three, and then we'll move on to the next series of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions, if I may, sir.
Yes, sir.
Secretary Lane, thank you, and thank you for all your commitment to doing the right thing. So has your staff done any shocks analysis? We're almost 9 years into this business cycle since third quarter of 2009 when we supposedly came out of the recession. So we're overdue for a business cycle correction. Has your office and your secretariat done shocks analysis for two shocks? One, an interest rate increase of 75 to 100 basis points over the next near term, year or so, short term, and two, a 10% or a 20% even, correction in the equities market. I got a lot of seasoned individuals back home that ain't buying bonds, but they require that equity.
The answer is anecdotally yes, and that'll be a big part of this year's revenue forecasting. And then what we've found is in the short term, we look like we're in pretty good shape. Long term, if you go back and look at some of the 2013-14 era in that, if it's because of economic issues, it tends to be slow. If it's because of fiscal issues that Washington does, they tend to act much quicker. So the answer is anecdotally yes, and that's why Mr. Chairman has agreed, the chairman and the money committees have agreed to look at the amount of money we put in reserves. I didn't put them on this list because I think we've done a good job where we are. But the policy of what we need to put in there, $1 billion seems like a lot, but $21 billion in general fund revenues, not including the non-general fund, if we were to have a 10% hit, we'd have some issues. So the answer is yes, very much aware anecdotally. In terms of, actually models, we haven't actually built a model, but we're very much aware of it.
Mr. Chairman, follow up.
Yep.
So, sir, you asked earlier if you had any questions or concerns. I would ask your staff to do that more than just simply anecdotally. But I think, Secretary Lane, we're going to need to have that data because we don't want to be further shocked by something we could have been preparatory to. My second question is this, and I don't want to misrepresent either you or the governor back home, but as I understand it from page 26, you're proposing a $3 billion tax increase on Virginians over the next 5 years. And on page 31, you're proposing a $250 million increase in taxes on Virginians annually. So I presume that'd be another 1.25. So would I be accurate in representing the governor's position back home that his preference is to increase taxes $4.2 billion over the next 5 years, or would I be inaccurate?
I would respectfully say you're inaccurate.
Okay.
First of all, there's been no change in tax law in Virginia. That's a policy change. The only, what individuals can make the decision that they want to maximize their federal benefit, they can do that. But if they don't want to pay $1 more in state tax, don't take the federal benefit. That $4 billion is a choice. I think it's worth it, quite frankly. But that's a choice I have from that. Virginia does not force you to take that federal benefit. Now, I'm not sure what the $4 billion, that's what Virginians get from the federal tax relief on a net basis. And so that's nothing to do with our revenues. It is what they receive. What the $250 million the governor has proposed, Virginia would, if we conform totally and don't make any changes to our law, then would receive roughly $500 million in the year, and he's projected to take 250 of that and give it to those 52% of Virginians that make less than $50,000.
Right.
I think that would be a better way to portray what he meant to say, what he
Thank you,
said.
Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I note a couple of things in here. One is the cautionary note that both you and the governor struck in terms of changes to tax policy and what we can anticipate and the uncertainties that there are. I contrast that with page 30 that suggests spending a fair amount on various initiatives, which seems to be premised in part on the anticipation that there will be significant new revenues resulting from the Supreme Court decision and federal policy. Do you find that a little bit ironic to see that?
No, sir. Let me explain to that. I did from our general increase in payroll withholding. If I were to guess what this year reforecast would be, and John Lehman's going to shoot me in the back, but from the trends we're showing, we're probably close to about $150 million a year from our general revenues in that regard. Internet sales tax, as you said, would be roughly about $100 million, which is ongoing in that regard. What I think the governor is suggesting is that we somehow balance between what initiatives we think are important and then being prudent. I mentioned reserves. We've done a lot. I don't think we're done in reserves. We're putting almost $90 million over the next year or two. But I think another part of government is to provide services, and some of the things he mentioned, like broadband, and I think other things are important to Virginians. So it's a policy decision. There may be those that may be more conservative, those that may be more liberal, and I don't mean in terms of ideologically, but in terms of spending money. So I think it's a policy decision that the governor has said this is where he'd like to see the debate start from, but it's obviously we're up for debate.
Thank you, Mr.
Vice Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I've got two questions, one budget and one tax related, with your permission. First of all, Mr. Secretary, I'm glad you have that slide up and it's staying up there. I think the commitments going forward and the risk obviously are something we should consider. I would add to that list the accelerated sales tax that many of us do not like as a mechanism that we've used, but that's something that hopefully you'll add to that list as well when you all are considering budget deliberations. But related to the budget, what are you all directing the agencies to look at related to their budgets when they're making submissions to you all at this point?
Well, we haven't, I'll go all through that. I will say to you, though, that obviously from my 6 months in looking at the budgeting process, I think we can do better. I think part of it is certainly we have to start with the actual known commitments we have, and many of those are driven, and then looking at governor priorities and legislative priorities.
Okay.
In
Mr.
that.
Chairman.
And then if we want to make, I'll tell you a perfect example, and the governor mentioned it with the salaries and raises given to public the teachers and the public safety people. If we don't make that a priority, then we won't get it back from the agencies, because they'll come back and say, well, don't have enough to do that. And I'm not being critical of them, but I'm saying that's where I think, working with you, we need to direct them as to where those monies should be spent. And that's part of the budget process, and we'll be asking for them, and I guess work collaboratively with you as to what we determine those priorities should be.
Okay. Mr. Chairman,
yes, sir.
Follow-up question then would be, or my second question, and I agree with that assumption. I think that's a good way to posture going forward related to the budget. I think that's the way we look at it in prioritizing the budget, both Senate Finance and House Appropriations. My second question is a follow-up to Delegate Garrett's question. Why, Secretary Lane, is the governor looking at, and on slide 22, you describe the middle-income taxpayers in the second bullet there as being 50,000 to 150,000. Why doesn't he consider this really, in my estimation, a tax increase for those individuals if we don't give them some relief? And more importantly, the way I would look at this is would be a serious move towards a redistribution of wealth for those individuals. So why would he go and hit the middle income taxpayers who actually are paying, obviously, a significant part of the federal and state tax, and then redistribute that to individuals who are not paying taxes?
Well, I would respectfully, Delegate Landis, take issue with your assumption that it's a tax increase. Virginia hadn't made any tax changes. As a result of Virginia federal law, individuals in Virginia may make different decisions to maximize their federal benefit. Virginia has made no tax changes.
Mr. Chairman? Yes, sir. Well, Secretary Lane, I think you would agree, if we don't take some action, their taxes are going to increase. Their state tax commitment and liability will increase.
Yes, sir. I pointed out $115.50 in the average. They'll receive a federal benefit of about $1,500 or a little bit more. But I wouldn't do it. But quite frankly, if they don't want their state taxes to increase, then file the taxes to optimize that way. Now, I'm not trying to be facetious. These are choices people make. We already have them in the current law. And so what the model does, let's take the average deduction between $12,000 and right now we're at 12, the feds are at 24 for family. Well, there are a lot of people that, I've given you the impact the model assumes if you have $3,999, then you'll take the standard deduction. You may not, because you're $1 away. We didn't know where to cut it off. But you might say, I'm not going to take it. I'm going to itemize because it's worth it, because I have a tax provision at the state level that offsets that, because I've got some type of credit I want to use at the state level. So I don't believe the governor has raised $1 of taxes. What he said is there's a windfall, and he is saying we haven't made any changes to our tax law. Do we want to keep that and use it for other things? He's proposed it. Or do you want to give it back in type of some other tax relief? That's a policy decision. But I don't see it as a tax increase because there's been no action taken, and every individual doesn't get a tax. Only 26% of Virginians actually pay more taxes. So there will be others if we would take some action. For instance, I've heard we ought to give everybody a $100 refund, or give everybody for a $100 refund for single, $200 for married. That's $440 million. Because everybody, so Dr. Lang, it's not trying to be argumentative. I just have a different view of the assumptions you're making, and you're also making the assumption that the tax code today is fair to everybody. And that's where I started. I don't know, fair never enters into it for me. It's either policy and revenue generation and where we want to make people's actions. And I don't mean to be, again, argumentative, but that's the way I believe that we've looked at it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator Norman, and then Delegate Carter.
Talking about investing in Main Street and working families, just so I don't make an inaccurate assumption that would be subject to a retort, can you share with me what thoughts there are about making health care more affordable? And I say that particularly in light of what I understand is a projection of health insurance premiums going up as much as $800+ in the next year.
I can give you some examples, and I have the policy team here in that, but quite frankly, I think a lot of that had to do with health care for state employees or in different areas or their percentage. That was part of the discussion there that was being talked about. There are other areas that I know have come about, but it is not in the Medicaid area, if that's a specific question.
Delegate Carter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jimmy, they don't give us microphones.
That's right, no problem. Hey, they're going to take mine away, Delegate Carter, don't worry.
Where's the hook?
Mr. Secretary, I'd like to echo the first set of comments that Delegate Garrett made. I am seeing a lot in this report that is eerily reminiscent of 2006 and 2007. Frankly, we all know what happened in 2008. And when I look at the landscape at the federal level, I see that they have a lot fewer tools in their toolkit to deal with an economic crisis than they did in 2008. Interest rates are lower now than they were then, so they don't have as far as they can go. We've already stretched quantitative easing, quite frankly, as far as we can stretch that without facing some serious inflationary pressures. So I would just like to echo Delegate Garrett's sentiment that I would very much like to see a report from your agency about revenue forecasting in the event of some sort of economic crisis in the future, because I do believe that we're in a scenario where we are in danger of that.
Okay, I do agree. That's why I mentioned it, and we will get more. That'll be part of the forecasting process. I actually think, and the governor's proposal has the refundable credit would mirror federal policy, and that would expire if federal policy expired. And I would think anything we've used with these monies ought to have that in mind. And quite frankly, I'd be more than happy to work with you on some type of stress test, because I actually believe that we need to consider those. And we have been, as I said, anecdotally, and we'll make that a part of the reforecasting process this year.
Any other questions for the Secretary? If not, I'm sorry, Delegate Sickles, did not see you down there. My apologies,
Mr.
sir.
Chairman, I have one comment that maybe you have a reaction to, and then a question. My comment is on your list of priorities, healthcare, with regard to the waivers. We have 12,000 people waiting now, and 3,000 on the high priority list. We're making a good stab at that in the current budget with almost 900, but that wasn't listed on your thing. And we have a crisis almost, I think at our CSBs, they would say they have a crisis in mental health care with our own hospitals being overcrowded. There's no place to, a lot of people that are in our hospitals shouldn't be there, in our jails that shouldn't be there, and we need to address that. That's not on your priority list. I mean, we need to fund our STEP Virginia program And so that's, if you want to comment on that.
This is not meant to be an all-inclusive list in that, and in fact, I have a very long list, a very long list. I'm sure
Okay.
Dr. Kerr and his team will be happy to address that during the, I should mention, that there's going to be a budget that's going to come out here pretty soon, that budget contest. But I have been to, this past week, last couple of weeks, to various facilities around the Commonwealth. The last one was at Central State, and I could not agree more that we have some issues we've got to deal with at those facilities. In fact, I've asked them to give me a report on what are deferred maintenance, and I won't get into all that, but I'm just telling you, we got to do something there.
Okay.
And so I agree with you,
thank you, thank
but
you.
I'm not submitting the entire budget now.
Yep.
Mr.
Mr. Chairman, my question would be, on a comprehensive, we are trying to, with our Medicaid expansion, make work better for people, get people in there. So do you view your EITC proposal, it's based on someone's tax liability, I understand it. I mean, how much you refund, it's not.
Yeah, so it is, we use the tax system as a payment vehicle. The actual tax, which I said I think President Reagan signed into law and part of Paul Ryan's plan, the actual tax is based on earned income, so you have to be working. I think it phases out right around $54,000, depending on your exemptions, and depending on how many dependents you have, that's what the tax or the credit is based on. At the Virginia, we take 20% of what the federal level is. So, whatever 20% of what they qualify at the federal level. By the way, at the federal level, it's refundable. The reason that the income tax system is used is because, obviously, if we're going to put that back in the economy, we don't want to have them pay the lowest taxes. And so it's first used to offset as a collection system. Most states refund it. We don't in Virginia, and that was the governor's proposal. But it is about earning family. These people are going to put it back into buying, fixing their house, buying a car. It is meaningful as a percentage of their income.
And I guess this is a Brendan question, if I'll follow up, but our Medicaid expansion program, we're trying to get people who can work to work, and these are going to be minimum wage jobs if we get them a job. So isn't this part of a whole package that can help lift our economy, since 70% of our economy is based on consumer spending anyway?
Well, obviously, that this was considered how it dovetails into the Medicaid expansion and the General Assembly's desire to make sure we were encouraging people to work as much as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Byron?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Lane, just two questions, I think. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot of scenarios where we have models but not any detailed thoughts on exactly how it's going to affect people. We just know, based on your definition of windfall, that there's going to be some additional monies. You mentioned about conformity being about definition, and then we do the policy later. My first question is there anything in those definitions that give us concern? I mean, there's a lot that can be said for federal definition of certain policy that we might adapt to. Is there anything that gives the governor concern with the definitions?
First of all this is online, so none of this is out there where we've given you information. I've made it available to all the teams and everybody, the staff department. You work and look at anything you want to. It's all online, and the public access also. Second of all, historically, since we've been to a conformity state, we've conformed to that. So I don't see anything in the definitions. Every once in a while, I think last year disaster relief were one of the things that, working with Chairman Lee and his committee, were not conformed to. I obviously would look at working with him as go through it. But no, I don't see anything in it. If we don't define what an itemized deduction is, it's going to be difficult for us to do policy. And if they're different at the federal and state levels, there's no certainty. So, but I'm welcome if there's any issues. I'll be happy to work with the legislature and Chairman Lee and work through those. But I don't see anything in there that we haven't normally conformed to. Okay,
my second question has to do with the date you mentioned about December 31st. So if something, Virginia needs to advance the date and conform, So does the governor plan on calling a special session in order to do this, or what is the governor's plan?
I have no knowledge of the governor planning a special session for tax policy. In fact, talking with the chairman here, it was pretty much decided that this will be taken care of. It's usually the first bill that's done every year. And we usually conform at December 31st, so this is nothing unusual. It's the first bill that has an emergency clause. It's typically done this way every year.
So you would say that we have to decide then immediately upon session whether or not we are going to conform to what the federal law is and have an idea what we're going to do about the itemization on our tax returns.
What I'm saying is we'll obviously be working together with the General Assembly over the next few months in terms of the conformity. As far as 2018 goes, 2018, I think we're fairly limited. If there's going to be a response, it's going to have to be either in refunds or some other mechanism. We simply don't have time to get everything in the taxes done. And it's not just our tax department, it's tax preparers across the Commonwealth. I've met with all of them. They need certainty. So hopefully we can send a signal of where we're going, but I have no knowledge of the governor calling a special session based on the conversations we've had, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Are there any other questions for the Secretary? Yes, Senator Howell.
Thank you. Is it possible for you or tax to show us geographically where this money will flow? It seems to me it will impact the parts of the state that are most stressed and would be an ability for them to spend more money and reinvest it in communities and so on.
Again, I would be happy to provide a map. In fact, but as a general definition, it's in every area, but the majority is in areas outside of major population areas.
Are there any other questions? If not, to piggyback on what Delegate Byron, her questions. So, Mr. Secretary, I appreciate, I can say on behalf of the members, the work that's been done by you, your staff, and all that have been involved in this process. We discussed this back, I think, probably almost, starting in November, and then when you came in January. So this is very helpful. Look forward to doing a deeper dive. To the issue of conformity, so on page 20, you kind of gave us an overview of that there are policy adjustments that can be made. If I look at your page 26, for example, there is nothing that would prevent us from saying, we will proceed with conformity contingent upon doing simulation 4 and simulation 6 for 18, and then we can move forward and have a general policy discussion on what we want to do in what I would call a comprehensive tax reform initiative.
There's nothing that would keep us from doing that other than I need to just make sure we physically can get that done. But no, although the more complicated, the more it's going to be.
Well, that's why I'm using specific examples of simulation 4 and simulation 6, because we would have those examples already, what that would mean. We could then get out, I would assume, to the CPAs who prepare tax returns, because this past year when we did not conform on the medical deduction side, they had to go back and redo some files, some filings that were done.
I'd love to have Craig and his team, but that's the whole idea of the model, is to give you things to make tax policy on.
And before we adjourn, I want to make sure that Delegate Bell has an opportunity. If he wants to ask a question remotely, I believe we can unmute him now. I think they told him. And we can have any question he might have. Do we have him on the line, or is he asleep?
I am on the line. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can. Good morning.
I am. Good morning from Cheyenne, Wyoming. I'm not sleeping. I have no questions, and just thanks to you and the staff for working with me to make it possible for me to join the meeting this way. And thank you for all the great information from the speakers.
Thank you very much. With that, anything else to come before the joint assembly of the money committees? Tonight we shall rise.